because you can do any of these three in either the cornea or the lens. Let's talk about multifocality. So we did a literature's plan complete this year. We looked for all of the corneal procedures which were used to treat presbyopia. And what we found was, this is a total literature search from 2004, we found that the safety and the efficacy was very low in 2004, and when we go up to 2012 to 2017, the safety was still low and the efficacy was still low. And that when we went further from 2017 to 2023, it was still low and still not very efficient. So I totally understand why people say corneal procedures are not ideal for presbyopia treatment. I get it. However, what we're going to look at now is what type of treatments. But before I do that, I want to now compare corneal treatments, and we're going to look at the fact that, this is not a meta-analysis, it's an average analysis. But what we looked at was Presbyon, Reed, Visumax, and Spherical, which are the 4 commercially available systems. Remember that Reed only treats low hyperopia. The others treat myopia, hyperopia, and emetropia. And you can see that the reading vision for all of these procedures is pretty good. Pretty good. But the distance vision is very different between these 2 procedures. Reed is a little kind of subset of Presbyon in some ways. Visumax and Spherical are a different class. They are multifocal corneas. That is not the same. And so when you look at the safety of Visumax and the safety of Spherical is significantly lower than the safety of smooth spherical aberration-based treatments. So if you're looking cross-section, this is just diagrammatically, that's what a Visumax profile looks like, that's what a Spherical looks like, and that's what Presbyon looks like. And for myopia, you cannot treat with the Alcon. And that's because you are targeting a -0.6Q, which means the center has to be steeper than the periphery, which means that if you treat a -5, you flatten the cornea. How are you going to get the center to be steeper than the periphery if you flatten it? By making a central island. So it becomes a multifocal cornea. Hyperopia, Schwind, Spherical, Presbyon, and Alcon. Do you see? This is the difference. These are 2 classes of treatment. And if we look at the topography of the ablation profile, this is the ablation profile of a Visumax. This is the topography and ablation profile of a Spherical. And this is Presbyon. Obviously, Alcon doesn't do myopic treatments. If we look at the actual post-op with the actual pre-op on specific eyes, you see that for this hyperopic case, you have this central nipple on the Visumax, you have a central nipple with Spherical, but you don't have that with Presbyon, and you don't have that with Reed. They are different. So when we're talking about multifocal corneas, that is Spherical and Visumax, there's a high chance that you're going to have night vision problems and reduced contrast and low tolerance. And obviously, if you want to do an enhancement, it's not that straightforward. Whereas, if we talk about monovision now, this is the oldest way of treating presbyopia. The challenge is, which everyone knows, is that there's either an intermediate loss or a near insufficiency because you've made lower monovision. There's distance vision loss because there's neural subtraction, because the dominant eye, which may be perfect at distance, experiences a sort of neural subtraction from the non-dominant blurred eye. We know that if the anisometropy has more than 1.5 diopters, there is actually loss of stereoacuity, and when you stop the monovision, the stereoacuity does not come back. So it's like a one-way street. We know that obviously both eyes are not working together, so you have the loss of what we normally have, which is summation between the eyes. So you have more vision when your eyes are when you're binocular than if you're monocular. And we know that monovision is tolerated by 50 or 60% of people, and you have to do a contact lens trial, and it's a little bit awkward if someone didn't wear contact lenses before, etc. So these are the challenges. So monovision, you know, you can have either near or intermediate, and there's a moderate chance of night vision disturbances. But now let's talk about the real subject, which is spherical aberration used to increase depth of field. And this is a natural aberration. The eye of the human has practically no spherical aberration until we're in our 20s. And then the spherical aberration of the eye starts to go up. But spherical aberration, remember, is not multifocal. It's not more than one focus in the same eye. And so, just to get it really down to basics, an aspheric lens on a Nikon camera is working very well because the angle of incidence, no matter where the light hits, is the same. And that means that the refraction goes to a single point. Whereas, if you have a spherical lens, like a sphere, the angle of incidence, depending on how far you are away from the axis, is different. And that's why central rays will focus further away and peripheral rays will focus closer. That's the physics, right? Well, that difference ends up being a depth of field. And you could say, yes, it's a depth of field, but it comes at a cost of lowering visual quality because it's not a point. It's a zone. It's a circle of Strum. It's a zone. But that's not exactly how it works, because when you have no spherical aberration, you have no depth of field. But when you have spherical aberration, you do have depth of field, but a slightly blurred retinal image. The thing is, the brain filters spherical aberration. That's why LASIK works. Every single treatment by LASIK has a change in spherical aberration. But if we keep the increase within a range that the brain can tolerate, then nothing happens to your contrast. And that's the secret. That's the secret of spherical aberration. And so in presbyon, we have a depth of field of 1.5 diopters around a target of minus 150. And in the distance eye, we have a depth of field of 1.5 diopters around a target of 0, which means that these two intersect at the 0.75 level. The distance eye sees minus 0.75 at intermediate, and the near eye sees minus 0.75 at distance. That's the amount of blur. And this is why it's tolerated by 95% of people who walk through the door in the clinic, because it's still binocular. It's a binocular modification, not a modification of monovision. Monovision, there's no depth of field. It's not binocular. Presbyon is binocular. Now, when you look at how spherical aberration affects, when you look at how sphere affects blur, this is minus 150, it really blurs the image. But if you add spherical aberration to the same minus 150, you get more edge detection. So that's a physical thing. You've spread the focus, and therefore you have more edge detection. But you see, that is not what the brain has to marry. Because the brain is filtering some of the blur on the retina from spherical aberration, actually the brain only has to marry those two images, which is very easy for the brain to do. It is not the same as marrying monovision. That's more difficult, okay? This is just kind of kindergarten explanations. So in the non-dominant eye, with your target of minus 150 plus spherical aberration, you have a better image. Remember that even if you're 70 years old, when you look close, your pupil constricts. It's meiosis, it's part of the triad. Well, it doesn't happen if you have neurosyphilis, but it does. Normally it happens. Therefore, the pupil constriction also gives you increased depth of field. So now you're dealing with an even more improved retinal image that has spherical aberration, which the brain then filters and gives you a good image. So it's actually not just one thing. And the results of blended vision presbyon are phenomenal. Why? Because it's LASIK, and LASIK is very accurate. Much more accurate than any IOL calculation will ever achieve, because we still will never achieve the ELP, elephant in the room. If you have the light adjustable lens, sure, okay, then you can make it as accurate. But we have no loss of two lines, we have no loss of stereo acuity. In fact, without correction, because the patients are binocular, they still retain stereo vision without correction. I have 40 seconds of stereo. I had my presbyon 8 years ago. There is no loss of contrast. In fact, there's a slight increase in contrast. It's not clinically significant, but we can measure it. And there are now, it's not a new procedure. For presbyon, there are now, in fact, 19 peer-reviewed publications. One of them is on airline pilots. We had 22 pilots. These are commercial pilots who fly, for most of them, for British Airways. And we have a questionnaire which was developed by the pilots of all of the things that they found difficult with glasses and contact lenses before surgery, and how they perceived their functionality after surgery without glasses. So this is approved, and in the CAA in the UK, which is like the FAA in the US, they are aware of presbyon and they approve it. It is no problem. It's very different from multifocals and pilots, where the pilot is taking a risk of losing their job, because if they don't pass glare testing and contrast testing, they lose their job. Now, if we look at the outcomes of presbyon, this is all of the papers published. One of them had a very low pre-op best spectacle corrected vision of 20. But if you look at them, all of them have very, very good vision. The enhancement rate, which we published initially, and everyone seems to be sticking to that, was very high at about 20%. But that was because we were using the Hansatone before. When we started using a femtosecond, the Visumax, the enhancement rate went way down. And now the enhancement rates, as you can see, they're well below 10%. Now, Sri Ganesh was one of the first surgeons to have presbyon 10 years ago. He was a low hyperope. This is published everywhere. He did a study on his patients and found that for myopia and hyperopia, the patient satisfaction was almost 100%. The spectacle independence was almost 100%. And there were no dysphotosias. Andrea Russo in Italy, same thing. Near 100% satisfaction, near 100% spectacle independence, and nearly no dysphotosia. In fact, if you look at the table again, spherical aberration to induce extended depth of field is actually the only way that we currently have to restore near and distance vision and intermediate. And the fact is, you can do this with IOLs now. So it took 20 years for the IOL community to sort of start admitting that trifocal diffractive optics are perhaps not as nice as we'd like them to be. And they are now producing presbyon IOLs. So every EDOF lens out there that is really EDOF is actually a presbyon IOL. The thing is, you say, well, why don't we just do lens surgery on everybody? Then it's one operation. Well, first of all, the accuracy is much lower. The risks are much higher. The side effects are higher. And it's not adjustable. And it's not reversible, because you can't have your natural lens back if you don't like it. And if you get a cataract later, you just do a monofocal lens. So here's what's really interesting, is that Sri Ganesh has the Salzburg reading desk, which is a scientific way of measuring reading speed. And I cannot explain this, and he cannot explain this. But the patients corrected for near vision before surgery were reading slower than they were after presbyon, without glasses. If you can think of an idea as to why that is, I would be very interested. So here's the summary. Basically, if you're going to do surgery in the lens, and you're going to do it while the patient still has accommodation, a 53-year-old still has 2 diopters of accommodation, 1.5. You're taking that out instantly, and you're replacing it with maybe 1 diopter of accommodation from your EDOF. That's not necessarily good for the patient. That accommodation is actually a zoom, which they can use to cover other areas. The prediction of whether you're going to get a cataract in the next 5 years is best done objectively, not at the slit lamp, but with the OSI from the HD analyzer or the Tracy. You can actually determine that, or with contrast. Contrast sensitivity measurements are very good. The retinal detachment risk is something that's been very much ignored in the presbyopic phaco-refractiva world. If the axial length is more than 25 and you're male, your risk of a retinal detachment in the next 3 years, if your vitreous was attached, which is when you're in your 50s, is 10%. Posterior vitreous detachment is not something that I see people talking about in clear lens exchange surgery. The myth that you cannot do LASIK in people who are older because of dry eye is a myth. Between Glenn Karp and I, we have done we've treated 12,000 patients with presbyon in the last 20 years. If there was a problem with dry eye, we would have not been a refractive surgery clinic anymore. We would be a dry eye clinic, because that's all we'd be doing. Or maybe we'd be in prison or something. The overall safety of LASIK is the same no matter what age you are, but the overall safety of intraocular surgery increases the older the eye. Plus, if you have your lens replaced now with the newest lens, in 10 years' time, that's not the newest lens. There might be a much better lens. There might be an actual accommodative lens. So technically, in our argumentation here, in this room of, I'm going to assume, phaco-refractive surgeons, all of us would agree that doing a lensectomy in a patient who's under 47, not the ideal. I think we can agree on that. So we're agreeing on that this cornea is the best place for those patients. But what will happen as you start to do a non-multifocal corneal presbyal procedure, you will find that you're starting to do more age, and then perhaps you'll reach the stage that I'm at, or Dr. Gil over there, who we don't do lens surgery if the patient doesn't have a cataract. Doesn't matter how old they are. My father was 74. He had presbyon because he had good contrast in 2016 best corrected vision. He had a cataract done in one eye when he was 86 with a monofocal with low PCO rate. So at the end of the day, what happens if you get a cataract after presbyon? Well, it's very easy. You've got corneal spherical aberration on the visual axis. 1 minute. You put a monofocal lens in. You can choose to put positive, neutral, or negative spherical aberration in the IOL. And you can also do it the other way around. You can do monofocal cataract surgery and then do presbyon on top. And then you have premium surgery because you have a premium intraocular lens which does not change contrast. And then you have presbyon, which does not change contrast, but gives you extended depth of field at all distances. So the ideal candidate for presbyon is someone who passes the test and doesn't have a cataract. And 97% of people pass the test if they're emmetropes, which is the hardest ones to pass. We're going to talk about this not in 15 minutes, but actually over a whole day with all modalities, lenses and corneas, in one of the days of our Sao Paulo course. The other 2 days will be SMILE and expert LASIK technique. And I thank you very much for allowing me to speak late. And I completely appreciate the fact that I was put last in the session, very much for this reason. Thank you.